Let's talk about Charles Darwin, the famous English naturalist who, along with Alfred Russel Wallace, first proposed that organisms change over time, from generation to generation, due to a process called natural selection. Natural selection is a form of microevolution. According to the theory, organisms are adapted to their environments. The organisms with the best adaptations have the best chances of survival and the greatest potential to produce many offspring. These adaptations are passed from parent to offspring generation after generation. Over time, the adaptations that enhance survival and reproduction become more and more common in the population, until each individual possesses the character. In 1859, Darwin published his most famous work, a book called On the Origin of Species, which provided compelling evidence in support of the theory of natural selection. Darwin famously studied the finches of the Galapagos Islands, using them to demonstrate how species are adapted to their environments. For example, he argued species that eat large seeds tend to have large, tough beaks, while those that eat insects have thin, sharp beaks. But his evidence went much further than this example. Darwin also considered the geographic ranges of taxa, and how geographic barriers and gradients can help to explain the distributions of species. He reviewed examples of artificial selection, in which humans create new varieties of species by selectively breeding them generation after generation. The most famous example of artificial selection in Darwin's writings may be fancy pigeons, which were produced by domestication and selective breeding of simple rock pigeons, yielding a vast variety of morphological diversity. If humans could produce all of these varieties of pigeons through artificial selection over time, he argued, then it is likely that there are natural phenomena that can produce the same effects. He looked too at embryos of different species, pointing out that different species of a kind tend to grow and develop from very similar embryos, even if their mature adults differ in striking ways. This is true of amphibians and mammals, shown here. These embryos are similar, he argued, because all of the species have evolved through descent with modification from one common ancestor. He also considered rudimentary or vestigial organs and body parts, that is, organs and body parts that serve no real purpose today. Why does a human have an appendix? Why do some snakes and whales have pelvic and hind limb bones? Why do flightless birds have wings? According to Darwin's theory, these rudimentary and vestigial organs are artifacts of evolution. Species have inherited and retained these characters from their ancestors, even though these characters no longer serve their original purpose. Finally, Darwin explored the concept of taxonomy, using his theory to explain why living organisms can be classified into a hierarchical system. The reason, he showed, is because species share aggregates of characters which they have inherited from their ancestors. Indeed, Darwin was the first person, arguably, to conceive of evolutionary trees, such as this one, which he drew in his bee notebook on transmutation of species in 1837. All life on Earth, he argued, could be traced back to one very distant common ancestor, the first life form to evolve on Earth. On the Origin of Species went a long way in convincing people that the theory of natural selection is a valid one. Today, it is regarded as one of the most important publications in the history of science. Since the time of Darwin, scientists have discovered a variety of other processes and phenomena that contribute to the evolution of life. Nonetheless, natural selection is still widely considered to be the grand unifying concept of life science, and it is generally thought that it explains most evolutionary change on our planet. Darwin, to his credit, recognized that there were potential problems with his theory. In particular, Darwin had a particular dilemma when it came to the fossil record. Naturally, the study of fossils should provide evidence in support of natural selection. After all, they provide us with a record of the evolutionary history of life on Earth. While Darwin was completing his seminal work, the oldest fossils known at the time were those of animals from the Cambrian period. Sponges, brachiopods, trilobites, mollusks, and other large macroscopic animals. However, his theory implied that all life on Earth was ancient, and that all organisms have descended through time from a single common ancestor. If his theory was correct, then Cambrian animals could not have simply sprung into existence. They must have evolved from simple organisms living during the pre-Cambrian. So, simply put, Darwin's dilemma was this: where were the fossils of organisms that lived prior to the Cambrian period? Where were the fossils of the ancestors of animals? In his book on the origin of species, Darwin dedicated an entire section to the fossil record. In his words, this was his dilemma. If the theory be true, it is indisputable that, before the lowest Silurian and Cambrian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, as long as, or probably far longer than, the whole interval from the Cambrian age to the present day, and that during these vast periods, the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question why we do not find such fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods, I can give no satisfactory answer. In the years following Darwin's seminal work, paleontologists made a wide array of discoveries that helped to solve Darwin's dilemma. We now know that Precambrian rocks contain a substantial and diverse fossil record, which helped to explain where our animals came from and why they appeared suddenly during the Cambrian period. For the first 2 billion years of Earth history, all life forms on our planet were microscopic organisms like these cyanobacteria. Eukaryotes evolved sometime before 1.8 billion years ago, during the Proterozoic eon. Over the rest of the Proterozoic, various macroscopic life forms began to appear, like Grippania, shown here. Most of these organisms, like Grippania, left behind leafy fossils. If they were alive today, you would probably call these organisms seaweed or algae. It is likely that most, if not all of these organisms were multicellular photoautotrophs. By the end of the Proterozoic, during the Cryogenian and Ediacaran periods, simple animals and animal-like eukaryotes began to appear for the first time on our world. These Precambrian animals probably included sponges, or at the very least, the direct ancestors of sponges. The biggest step, though, toward the evolution of animal life came during the Ediacaran, with the rise of the Ediacara biota. The Ediacara biota represents a variety of different types of organisms that lived in the ocean between 570 and 540 million years ago. They came in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some were frond-like. Others were shaped like discs. Some may have swam through the water, while others crawled along the sea floor. Some of the organisms in the Ediacara biota were probably animals. Others may have been prokaryotes, or fungi, or plants, or algae. Some of the organisms may have even belonged to groups of eukaryotes which are no longer alive today. But to be honest, scientists aren't really sure. After decades of study, scientists still aren't sure what produced the fossils of the Ediacara biota. It remains a subject of intense debate among paleontologists. But paleontologists are convinced of one thing. These life forms, whatever they were the first truly large, complex, multicellular organisms in Earth history. They made up the ocean's first major ecosystem of macroscopic life, and they did many, if not all of the things that you find today in animals. The organisms of the Ediacara biota reproduced through sexual reproduction. Some of them produced biomineralized skeletons, shells made up of carbonate minerals, for example. And many of them were capable of movement. They were motile or mobile. Although the organisms of the Ediacara biota did many of the things you can see in modern animals, they ultimately disappeared around 540 million years ago at the end of the Ediacaran period. Scientists now believe that the organisms of the Ediacara biota gave rise to modern animal life. These early animals that lived with the Ediacara biota likely competed with them for resources like food and space on the sea floor. This competition between the Ediacara biota and real animals, it is thought, drove the Ediacara biota to extinction. It was simply replaced by real animals, which were better adapted to their environment. This phylogenetic tree illustrates the relationships of some of the most important animal phyla in the fossil record. As you can see, the branches of most of the phyla can be traced back to the Ediacaran period. It is now generally thought that most of the phyla, including sponges, cnidarians, mollusks, arthropods, echinoderms, brachiopods, and perhaps bryozoans, all originated prior to the Cambrian, sometime during the Proterozoic. Although animals were insignificant components of the Ediacaran world, beginning early during the Cambrian period, they underwent a major evolutionary radiation called the Cambrian Explosion. If a mass extinction is an abrupt event where biodiversity falls rapidly due to many taxa going extinct, then an evolutionary radiation is the exact opposite. During an evolutionary radiation, biodiversity increases because many species are evolving and originating. Speciation is the process through which new species originate on our planet. Evolutionary radiations are times when there are high rates of speciation. It is generally thought there have been 3 evolutionary radiations of animal life since the Ediacaran. Each one resulted in a significant increase in the number of animal taxa, the number of species, the number of genera, the number of families, and the number of orders. The Cambrian explosion was the first of these 3 radiation events. Not only did the Cambrian explosion involve a significant increase in the number of species, it also entailed a major rise in morphological disparity. The morphology of an organism is its form, structure, and appearance. Its morphology is what it looks like and how it is shaped and sized. Morphological disparity is a measure of the amount of variation in morphology among species and taxa. More simply, it is a measure of how different things look with regard to their shapes, sizes, and characters. Speciation during the Cambrian explosion caused an increase in morphological disparity. Organisms of many new forms appeared for the first time. Morphological disparity had never been higher at any prior point in Earth history. Indeed, the Cambrian explosion was a turning point. Suddenly, there was a new and diverse array of life forms on Earth, each one more different than the last. Amazingly, virtually all major animal phyla make their first appearance in the fossil record in the Cambrian. There are at least 35 phyla of animals on Earth today, almost all of them left behind fossils in early Cambrian rocks. So what caused the Cambrian explosion? Why did it happen? Why did it happen when it did? What caused animals to become taxonomically diverse and morphologically disparate at that specific point in Earth history? Given that most of the animal phyla probably originated prior to the start of the Cambrian period, the radiation event was most likely triggered by some combination of environmental phenomena. There is no real consensus about the cause of the Cambrian explosion, and many scientists suspect that it was caused by a combination of circumstances. That said, one important factor may have been oxygen. At multiple times in Earth history, there were major oxygenation events that increased the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere and ocean of our world. The first and most significant oxygenation event, the first great oxygenation event, happened during the Proterozoic, between 2.5 and 2 billion years ago. The event was followed by the origin of multicellular and macroscopic eukaryotes. It is now thought there was a second event between 600 and 500 million years ago, a second great oxygenation event. This event coincided with the rise of animals in the Ediacaran and their evolutionary radiation in the Cambrian. Some scientists believe that the second great oxygenation event was necessary for the Cambrian explosion because animals need more oxygen than other forms of life. They simply have higher oxygen demands. So an increase in the availability of oxygen might have allowed animals to thrive. An oxygen-rich world, it is thought, supported animals with a variety of new adaptations, breeding morphological disparity and ecological variation. Whatever the case may be, our understanding of the origin of animals and their radiation during the Cambrian period has come a long way since the days of Darwin. While there are many questions left to answer about the causes of the Cambrian explosion, We can safely conclude that natural selection can help us to explain many observations of the fossil record.